The smell hit you before you even reached the door. It wasn't the pleasant aroma of Roman baths or the expensive perfumes worn by patrician women. This was something else entirely. Something that made hardened soldiers pause and reconsider their evening plans. The Sabura district's Lupana reeked of unwashed bodies, cheap wine, and desperation mixed with the sour stench of reused oil and old sweat that had soaked into wooden walls over decades. Inside, the scene was worse than the smell suggested. Women lined narrow corridors, their faces painted with lead-based cosmetics that slowly poisoned them while they worked. Their hair, once perhaps beautiful, now hung in greasy tangles, rarely washed and never properly cleaned. The oil they rubbed on their skin wasn't for pleasure, it was to mask the odor of too many clients and too little time between them. But this was just the surface of a hygiene nightmare that would make modern people physically ill. Tonight, we'll explore the shocking reality of cleanliness, or rather the complete lack of it, in ancient Rome's sex trade. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. So dim the lights, maybe light a candle for atmosphere, and prepare to learn why even the rats avoided certain corners of Roman brothels. If you think a medieval stable was unpleasant, you've clearly never stepped inside a Roman Lupana during the height of the empire. The door didn't swing open onto some exotic paradise painted on modern screens. It opened into a world where hygiene was a luxury these women couldn't afford, and cleanliness was a concept that died somewhere between their first client and their last hope. It hung there thick and heavy, like a blanket made of every bad smell imaginable. The stone walls wept with condensation that carried the scent of decades of human misery. Oil lamps burned cheap tallow, adding their own smoky contribution to the atmosphere, but nothing could mask what really filled these spaces. The women here came from across the empire, Germanic slaves, captured in frontier wars, Egyptian girls sold by desperate families, Greek hetairai, who had fallen from favor, British captives who still remembered the clean air of their homeland. All of them now shared the same fate, serving Roman citizens who cared nothing for their comfort, their health, or their humanity. These weren't the elegant courtesans of literature or the pampered mistresses of wealthy men. These were the forgotten women, the ones who worked in cells barely larger than modern closets, seeing dozens of men each day, with no time to wash between clients and no resources to maintain even basic cleanliness. Water was scarce and expensive. The famous Roman baths were for citizens, not slaves. A prostitute might go weeks without a proper wash, relying instead on whatever scraps and liquids she could find. Oil was reused until it turned rancid. Perfumes were watered down beyond recognition. Even the simple act of cleaning one's hands became a luxury few could afford. The clients didn't seem to mind, or perhaps they simply didn't notice. Lost in their own worlds of wine and temporary pleasure, they came seeking escape from the pressures of Roman life, and if that escape came with a side of poor hygiene, well, that was someone else's problem. But for the women, it was everything. The smell clung to their skin, soaked into their hair, and followed them everywhere. Even when they left the brothel, people knew where they worked, just by the scent that surrounded them, like an invisible cloud of shame. Cleanliness cost money, and money was something these women rarely saw. The brothel owners took the largest cut of any earnings. The remaining coins barely covered food and shelter, leaving nothing for the luxuries of soap, clean water, or fresh clothing. A bar of decent soap cost more than most prostitutes earned in several days. The cheaper alternatives, ash mixed with animal fat, harsh lye solutions or sand scrubs, often did more harm than good, leaving skin raw and infected. Many simply gave up trying, accepting that cleanliness was beyond their reach. The Roman economy had no place for the hygiene of society's lowest class. Merchants sold their finest oils and perfumes to wealthy matrons who bathed daily and changed clothes multiple times. But in the Sabura, the same merchants hawked rancid oils, watered-down vinegar, and recycled cloth that had already seen better days in someone else's household. Some women tried to pool their resources, sharing a single bar of soap among 5 or 6 workers. Others traded services for cleaning supplies, bartering precious time for a handful of clean rags. or a small jug of scented water. But these arrangements often fell apart under the pressure of survival, leaving everyone worse off than before. The brothel owners saw no profit in cleanliness. As long as clients kept coming, as long as coins kept flowing, the condition of the workers was irrelevant. If a woman became too odorous, too diseased, too obviously unclean even for these standards, she was simply replaced. There were always more desperate people arriving in Rome, ready to take any work they could find. This created a system where hygiene became impossible to maintain. Women worked in filth, lived in filth, and died in filth, all while generating profits for men who bathed daily in marble-lined pools and wore fresh togas made from the finest cloth. The working spaces themselves were monuments to poor planning and deliberate neglect. Stone cells, barely 6 feet by 6 feet, contained everything a prostitute owned: a thin mattress stuffed with straw, a clay oil lamp, and perhaps a wooden box for personal items if she was lucky enough to have any. The walls were limestone, which absorbed every smell and stain over decades of use. No amount of scrubbing could remove the odors that had soaked into the stone itself. The floors, when they weren't bare earth, were covered with worn tiles that cracked and chipped, creating perfect hiding spots for insects, bacteria, and worse. Small windows, more like slits really, provided minimal air circulation. The smoke from oil lamps had nowhere to go, creating a perpetual haze that burned the eyes and lungs. In summer, these spaces became furnaces. In winter, they were damp and cold, with condensation dripping from the ceiling onto already moldy bedding. The beds themselves deserve special mention in this catalogue of horrors. Straw mattresses were rarely changed, becoming compacted and foul-smelling over months of use. The straw attracted fleas, lice, and other parasites that feasted on anyone unfortunate enough to lie down. Clean sheets were a fantasy. Most beds were covered with rough cloth that was shaken out occasionally but never properly washed. Privacy was non-existent. Thin wooden partitions or hanging cloths separated one cell from another, providing visual barriers but no sound dampening. The cacophony of voices, moans, arguments, and bodily functions created a constant background noise that made rest impossible, and dignity a forgotten concept. These cells were cleaned, if at all, by the women themselves between clients. With no proper tools, no cleaning supplies, and no time, this usually meant pushing the worst debris into corners and hoping no one looked too closely. The accumulation of waste, both human and otherwise, created health hazards that would horrify modern sanitation experts. Dawn in a Roman brothel didn't bring fresh starts or clean slates. It brought the harsh reality of another day in conditions that would kill most people's appetite for weeks. The women who worked here had no morning rituals of bathing and grooming. Instead, they woke to the same stench they'd fallen asleep in, surrounded by the evidence of the previous night's work. If a woman was lucky, she might have access to a communal basin filled with water that had been used by others before her. This water, often grey and cloudy by the time it reached her, was expected to serve for drinking, washing, and cleaning between clients. The morning wash was a hurried affair, usually consisting of a quick splash of water on the face and hands, if water was available at all. Many women learnt to clean themselves with whatever was at hand: old wine turned to vinegar, olive oil that had gone rancid, or even urine, which Romans believed had cleansing properties. Clothing was another challenge entirely. Most prostitutes owned only 1 or 2 garments, which were worn continuously until they literally fell apart. These clothes absorbed every smell, stain, and bodily fluid encountered during work, becoming repositories of odors that no amount of airing or shaking could eliminate. The Roman toga, that symbol of civilization and refinement, was nowhere to be found in these establishments. Instead, women wore simple tunics made from the cheapest available cloth, often dyed with colors that ran in water and stained the skin. These garments were designed for easy removal, not comfort or cleanliness. Hair care was equally primitive. Without proper combs, brushes, or hair oils, women struggled to maintain even basic grooming. Many resorted to cutting their hair short, not for style, but for practicality. Long hair became tangled and matted, collecting odors and providing homes for parasites. The elaborate hairstyles worn by Roman matrons required time, tools, and money that prostitutes simply didn't have. Lead-based white paint for the face, antimony for the eyes, and rouge made from dangerous minerals created a painted mask that was slowly poisoning the wearer. These cosmetics, applied without mirrors and with minimal skill, often created a grotesque parody of beauty that satisfied no one, but was better than showing a bare, unwashed face. The men who visited these establishments weren't the refined patricians of Roman mythology. They were soldiers on leave, day laborers with a few coins, slaves with stolen money, and free men who couldn't afford better. Their personal hygiene was often no better than that of the women they visited, creating a perfect storm of poor sanitation. Roman soldiers, despite the military's reputation for discipline, often went weeks between baths during campaigns. They arrived at brothels carrying the sweat and grime of military life, adding their own odors to spaces already overwhelmed by poor air quality. Their rough handling left bruises and cuts that, without proper medical care, often became infected. Working-class Romans had limited access to the famous public baths. The entrance fees, while small, were beyond the reach of the poorest citizens. These men worked physical jobs in dusty, dirty conditions and rarely had opportunities for thorough cleaning. When they visited brothels, they brought the accumulated filth of their labors with them. Even wealthy Romans who visited these establishments weren't necessarily clean by modern standards. Roman hygiene, while advanced for its time, was still primitive by today's measures. They bathed irregularly, often going days between proper washes. Their idea of dental hygiene was chewing aromatic herbs, and their understanding of disease transmission was virtually non-existent. In fact, many seemed to prefer the obvious signs of degradation, viewing cleanliness as a sign that a prostitute was trying to rise above her station. A woman who smelled too pleasant or looked too clean might be accused of putting on airs or trying to attract wealthier clientele. This created a vicious cycle where women who made efforts to stay clean were actually punished by losing customers, while those who embraced or accepted their filthy conditions were rewarded with more business. The market forces of ancient prostitution actually incentivized poor hygiene. Violence was common and expected. Clients who had been drinking, which was most of them, often became rough or abusive. The resulting injuries, combined with poor medical care and unsanitary conditions, frequently led to infections that could have been easily prevented in a cleaner environment. Even for women who desperately wanted to maintain basic hygiene, the obstacles were insurmountable. Water, the most basic requirement for cleanliness, was a precious commodity that had to be hauled from public fountains or purchased from water sellers. A single amphora of clean water cost more than many prostitutes earned in a day. The water that was available was often contaminated. Rome's aqueduct system was a marvel of engineering, but by the time water reached the poorest districts, it had picked up all manner of pollutants. The lead pipes used throughout the city were slowly poisoning the entire population, but the effects were most pronounced among those who had the least access to fresh, clean sources. The Romans used a mixture of ash and animal fat that was harsh and often caused more skin problems than it solved. This primitive soap was expensive to make and even more expensive to buy, putting it far beyond the reach of most prostitutes. The alternatives were worse than ineffective. They were dangerous. Some women used strong vinegar to try to kill odors, but this often burned their skin and created painful sores. Others tried mixing ash with oil, creating an abrasive paste that stripped away not just dirt but healthy skin as well. Even if cleaning supplies had been available and affordable, there was no privacy or time to use them properly. Women were expected to be available to clients at all hours, with breaks barely long enough for essential bodily functions. The idea of taking time for a proper wash was not just impractical, but potentially dangerous if it meant refusing a paying customer. The clothing situation made everything worse. With only one or two garments that couldn't be washed regularly, women were trapped in a cycle of increasing filth. The cloth absorbed every odor and stain, becoming more offensive with each day, even if they had access to clean water. Washing clothes meant being naked and unable to work while the garments dried. Undergarments, as Romans knew them, were minimal and often non-existent among the poorest classes. This meant that outer clothing came into direct contact with the body, absorbing every secretion and odor. Without the barrier of clean undergarments, maintaining any level of cleanliness became virtually impossible. Summer in Rome was a nightmare for anyone trapped in the cramped, poorly ventilated spaces of the brothels. Temperatures soared above 100 degrees Fahrenheit, and without air conditioning or even adequate ventilation, these stone buildings became ovens that cooked their inhabitants slowly. The heat made every smell worse. Bodies that were merely unpleasant in cooler weather became nauseating in summer temperatures. Sweat mixed with dirt, oil, and bodily fluids to create a cocktail of odors that could be detected from blocks away. The stone walls absorbed and held heat, making the interiors even hotter than the outside air. Water became even more precious during heat waves. What little was available evaporated quickly, leaving behind concentrated salt and mineral deposits that created their own problems. Women desperate for relief sometimes resorted to drinking wine instead of water, leading to dehydration that made their skin dry and cracked, providing entry points for infection. The increased heat also accelerated the decay of organic matter, making the ever-present waste and garbage even more offensive. Food spoiled within hours, and the smell of rotting meat and vegetables added another layer to the already overwhelming assault on the senses. Winter brought different but equally serious challenges. The same stone walls that trapped heat in summer held cold in winter, creating damp, chilly environments that promoted the growth of mold and fungus. Without adequate heating, women were forced to huddle together for warmth, spreading diseases and parasites among themselves. Clothing that was already inadequate became even more insufficient in cold weather. Thin tunics provided little protection against winter winds, and women often developed chilblains, frostbite, and other cold-related injuries. Their compromised immune systems, weakened by poor nutrition and constant stress, made them even more susceptible to winter illnesses. The reduced daylight hours of winter made hygiene even more challenging. With only oil lamps for light, it became nearly impossible to see dirt and stains clearly enough to clean them effectively. Women essentially worked and lived in darkness for months at a time, never quite sure how clean or dirty they actually were. Disease spread through Roman brothels like wildfire through dry grass, without any understanding of germ theory or proper sanitation. These establishments became perfect breeding grounds for every ailment known to the ancient world. Skin diseases were so common they were considered normal, and women learned to work through infections that would hospitalize people today. Sexually transmitted diseases were rampant and untreatable. Syphilis, gonorrhea, and other infections spread freely among both workers and clients with no effective treatments available. The symptoms, painful sores, discharge, fever, and eventual madness were simply accepted as occupational hazards. Parasites were universal. Lice, fleas, bedbugs, and intestinal worms were so common that their absence would have been remarkable. These creatures fed on their human hosts constantly, causing itching, infection, and disease transmission. Women learned to live with the constant crawling sensation of insects moving through their hair and across their skin. Skin conditions flourished in the unsanitary conditions. Rashes, boils, and open sores were normal sights in any brothel. Without proper wound care, minor cuts and scrapes often became infected, sometimes leading to sepsis and death. The combination of poor nutrition, constant stress, and exposure to contaminated surfaces created perfect conditions for skin diseases to develop and spread. Respiratory problems were inevitable in the smoke-filled, poorly ventilated spaces. Women developed chronic coughs from breathing lamp smoke and dust, and many suffered from what would now be recognized as severe asthma or other breathing disorders. The constant exposure to poor air quality shortened lifespans and reduced quality of life even further. Mental health, while not understood in modern terms, was clearly affected by the horrific living conditions. Women developed what Romans called melancholia, a deep sadness and withdrawal from life. Others became aggressive or unpredictable, responses that made sense given their circumstances, but were seen as character flaws rather than symptoms of trauma. Dental care was non-existent, and tooth problems were universal. Without proper cleaning tools or techniques, teeth rotted quickly, causing pain, infection, and foul breath that added to the overall assault on the senses. Many women lost most of their teeth by age 30, if they lived that long. The stench and appearance of prostitutes marked them as clearly as any brand or tattoo. They couldn't hide their profession, because they carried it with them in the form of odors that no perfume could mask and stains that no clothing could conceal. This visible degradation ensured their complete isolation from respectable Roman society. Free Roman women avoided them completely, viewing them as sources of contamination and moral corruption. Even slave women looked down on prostitutes, grateful that their own situations, however difficult, hadn't fallen to such depths. This social rejection was total and absolute, extending even to their own families if they had any. Shopping for necessities became an ordeal of shame and rejection. Merchants refused to serve them or charged inflated prices for goods they knew the women desperately needed. Market stalls emptied when prostitutes approached, and vendors made no effort to hide their disgust and contempt. Religious institutions offered no comfort or support. While Roman religion was generally tolerant, prostitutes were considered polluted and were barred from most temples and religious ceremonies. They were cut off from the spiritual comfort that might have helped them endure their physical suffering. Even other prostitutes often turned on each other, competing desperately for the few clients who were willing to pay for their services. Friendship and mutual support were luxuries they couldn't afford when survival was at stake. The isolation was complete. They were alone in their suffering, surrounded by others who were equally alone. This social death was often worse than the physical hardships. Humans are social creatures who need connection and acceptance to maintain their mental health. The complete rejection experienced by Roman prostitutes contributed to their high rates of suicide, addiction, and violent behavior. Each day began with the same impossible choice: spend time trying to clean up or start working immediately to earn money for food. Most chose survival over hygiene, understanding that a day without clients meant a day without eating. This forced prioritization of immediate needs over long-term health created a downward spiral that few could escape. Food was scarce and of poor quality. The cheapest available provisions were often spoiled or contaminated, contributing to the digestive problems that plagued most prostitutes. A diet of stale bread, rotten fruit, and watered wine provided minimal nutrition while adding to the body odors that marked their profession. Sleep was fitful and interrupted. The combination of uncomfortable bedding, constant noise, parasites, and the stress of their situation made rest nearly impossible. Women learned to doze between clients, never achieving the deep sleep necessary for physical and mental recovery. Personal possessions were few and closely guarded. A comb with most of its teeth intact was a treasure. A small mirror, even if cracked and distorted, was worth fighting for. These tiny luxuries were the difference between maintaining some minimal level of hygiene and complete surrender to filth. Competition among the women was fierce and often vicious. A woman who managed to acquire soap or perfume might find it stolen within hours. The desperation of their situation turned potential allies into enemies, as each fought to maintain whatever small advantage she could manage. The constant threat of violence hung over everything. Clients, brothel owners, other prostitutes, and random citizens all posed potential dangers. Women learned to sleep with one eye open, and to hide any valuables in places where they might not be discovered by thieves. Money flowed through the brothels like water through a sieve, always moving but never staying long enough to accumulate. The women who actually provided the services that generated these profits saw only a tiny fraction of the income their bodies produced. This economic reality made hygiene not just difficult but impossible. A typical transaction might bring in enough coins to buy a small loaf of bread. After the brothel owner took his cut, the remainder was barely sufficient for one meal. The idea of setting aside money for soap, clean clothing, or other hygiene necessities was laughable when survival was uncertain from one day to the next. Prices for basic necessities were inflated in the districts where prostitutes lived and worked. Merchants knew they had a captive market of desperate people who would pay any price for essential goods. A bar of soap that might cost 1 denarius in a respectable neighborhood could cost 3 or 4 in the Sabura. Credit was non-existent for people in this profession. Without property, steady income, or social standing, prostitutes were considered the worst possible credit risks. They had to pay cash for everything, and at the highest possible prices, making every purchase a significant sacrifice. Some women tried to supplement their income through other means, begging, petty theft, or selling whatever they could scavenge. These activities carried serious risks, as being caught could result in severe punishment or even death. The legal system offered no protection for people in their position. The economic trap was complete and inescapable. Without resources to improve their hygiene and appearance, they couldn't attract better clients or higher prices. Without better income, they couldn't afford the resources needed to improve their situation. The cycle perpetuated itself with mathematical precision. Even within the world of Roman prostitution, there were distinctions and hierarchies based largely on appearance and perceived cleanliness. At the bottom were the women who worked in the cheapest brothels, serving the poorest clients, earning the least money, and therefore having the fewest resources to maintain their hygiene. These women, known as bustuarii, worked near cemeteries and garbage dumps, literally among the refuse of Roman society. Their clients were often drunk, violent, and unwilling or unable to pay even the minimal fees charged by more established brothels. The working conditions were correspondingly worse, with no pretense of comfort or cleanliness. Slightly higher in the hierarchy were the prostitutes who worked in the organized brothels of districts like the Sabura. While their conditions were still appalling by any reasonable standard, they at least had some protection from the elements and marginally better security than the street workers. At the very top of the prostitute hierarchy were the courtesans who served wealthy Romans. These women, often educated and cultured, had access to better hygiene resources and were expected to maintain higher standards of cleanliness. But even they existed in a precarious position, always at risk of falling down the hierarchy if they lost favor or aged out of desirability. The differences between these levels were stark but fragile. A courtesan who contracted a disfiguring disease or fell out of favor could quickly find herself in the Sabura brothels. A Sabura prostitute who caught the eye of a wealthy patron might temporarily rise in status, only to fall again when his interest waned. This hierarchy created additional tensions among the women, as each group looked down on those below them while aspiring to rise to the level above. The constant jockeying for position made cooperation and mutual support even more difficult to achieve. Many of the women working in Roman brothels weren't there by choice but as slaves captured in the empire's constant wars of expansion. These women, torn from their families and homelands, faced the additional trauma of complete powerlessness over their circumstances. Slaves had no rights and no recourse if they were abused or mistreated. Their owners could do anything they wished without fear of legal consequences. This absolute vulnerability meant that slave prostitutes often suffered worse treatment than their free counterparts who at least theoretically had some legal protections. The slave markets of Rome regularly supplied brothels with fresh victims. Germanic tribes, British Celts, Gallic warriors and captives from across the known world were bought and sold like livestock. Many of these women had come from cultures with different hygiene practices and had to adapt to Roman expectations and limitations. Language barriers made everything worse for foreign slaves, unable to communicate effectively with clients, other workers or owners. They were isolated even within the brothel community. This isolation made it even more difficult to learn survival strategies or acquire the resources needed to maintain basic cleanliness. Some slaves dreamed of buying their freedom, but the economics of prostitution made this nearly impossible. The money required for manumission was enormous compared to the tiny fraction of earnings they were allowed to keep. Most would die as slaves, having never again experienced freedom or dignity. The psychological impact of slavery compounded all the other horrors of their situation. These women had been reduced to property, valued only for their ability to generate income for their owners. This complete dehumanization made it even harder to maintain any sense of self-worth or hope for the future. Roman religion and culture viewed prostitutes as necessary evils, required for social stability, but morally contaminated and socially unacceptable. This attitude influenced how they were treated and the resources available to them, creating additional barriers to maintaining hygiene and health. The goddess Venus was associated with both love and prostitution, but the prostitutes themselves were not considered blessed or protected by her worship. Instead, they were seen as corrupted versions of femininity, unable to participate in the religious rituals that gave meaning to other Romans' lives. Cultural attitudes toward cleanliness were complex in Roman society. While the wealthy celebrated bathing and personal grooming as marks of civilization, the poor were expected to accept their dirty condition as natural and appropriate to their station. Prostitutes, at the very bottom of the social hierarchy, were expected to be the filthiest of all. The Roman concept of virtue was intimately connected to cleanliness and moral purity. Prostitutes, by definition, could never achieve virtue, and their physical uncleanliness was seen as an external manifestation of their moral corruption. This created a circular logic that justified their poor treatment and living conditions. Religious festivals and public celebrations were off limits to prostitutes, denying them the community connections and joy that helped other Romans cope with life's difficulties. They were forced to watch from the margins as the rest of society celebrated together, reinforcing their isolation and degradation. The cultural emphasis on family honor and ancestral respect had no meaning for prostitutes who were cut off from their families and had no hope of creating honorable lineages of their own. This cultural death sentence removed another potential source of meaning and motivation from their lives. Roman medical knowledge, while advanced for its era, was still primitive by modern standards and almost non-existent when it came to treating the diseases and conditions that plagued prostitutes. The connection between poor hygiene and disease was poorly understood, leading to treatments that often made conditions worse rather than better. Physicians rarely treated prostitutes, viewing them as contaminated and unworthy of medical attention. When treatment was provided, it was usually limited to the cheapest and most basic remedies, often administered by untrained individuals who caused more harm than good. The theory of the four humors dominated Roman medicine, leading to treatments that were completely inappropriate for the infections and diseases common among prostitutes. Bloodletting, purging, and other harsh treatments weakened patients who were already compromised by poor nutrition and living conditions. Surgical procedures were primitive and performed without anesthesia or proper sterilization. A simple procedure that might help with a medical condition could easily lead to fatal infection due to the unsanitary conditions in which it was performed. Mental health was not understood as a medical condition, so the psychological trauma experienced by prostitutes was dismissed as moral weakness or character flaws. No treatment was available for what we would now recognize as severe depression, anxiety, and post-traumatic stress disorder. The lack of medical understanding also meant that preventative care was non-existent. No one understood that improving hygiene and living conditions could prevent many of the diseases that killed these women. Instead, sickness and early death were accepted as inevitable consequences of their profession. These buildings were constructed as cheaply as possible, with no consideration for the comfort, health, or dignity of their inhabitants. Rooms were deliberately small to maximize the number of working spaces within each building. The tiny cells barely provided room for a bed and a client, leaving no space for personal possessions or hygiene activities. The cramped conditions made privacy impossible and ensured that odors and diseases spread quickly among the workers. Ventilation was poor or non-existent, as windows were viewed as security risks that might allow escapes or theft. The lack of fresh air circulation concentrated smells and smoke, creating an atmosphere that was literally toxic to breathe. These conditions contributed to the respiratory problems that plagued most prostitutes. Plumbing was minimal at best. If latrines existed at all, they were shared by dozens of women and rarely cleaned. More often, chamber pots or simple holes in the ground served as toilets, creating sanitation hazards that would horrify modern health inspectors. Lighting was provided by oil lamps that burned constantly, filling the air with smoke and creating fire hazards. The dim, flickering light made it difficult to maintain even basic cleanliness, as dirt and stains were hard to see clearly. Many women worked and lived in what was effectively permanent twilight. Structural maintenance was deferred indefinitely, as owners saw no profit in improving conditions for their workers. Leaking roofs, cracked walls, and broken floors created additional health hazards while making it impossible to keep spaces clean even if resources had been available for the attempt. The system was designed to trap women in cycles of exploitation that made escape nearly impossible. Every aspect of the economic, social, and physical environment worked together to ensure that prostitutes remained in their degraded condition until disease, violence, or exhaustion claimed their lives. New arrivals, whether slaves or free women driven by desperation, quickly discovered that survival required abandoning any hope of maintaining dignity or cleanliness. The immediate pressures of earning money for food and shelter, left no time or resources for longer-term health considerations. Women who did manage to accumulate small amounts of money found themselves targets for theft, extortion, or manipulation by brothel owners who had a vested interest in keeping them dependent. Any attempt to improve their situation was met with obstacles designed to maintain the status quo. The legal system provided no protection for prostitutes, who were considered morally and socially beyond the reach of justice. Crimes against them were rarely investigated or punished, and their testimony was considered worthless in court. This legal vulnerability made them prey for anyone seeking easy targets. Social services, such as they existed in ancient Rome, were not available to prostitutes. Charitable organizations focused on helping the deserving poor widows, orphans, and disabled citizens, while explicitly excluding those whose poverty was considered to be the result of moral failings. The only escape routes were death, which came early and often, or the extremely rare occurrence of being purchased or rescued by someone with both the means and the motivation to help. For the vast majority, their fate was sealed from the moment they entered the brothel. A typical day for a Roman prostitute began before dawn and ended well after midnight, with every hour filled with the struggle to survive in conditions that would drive most people to madness. The absence of any meaningful break from work, combined with the physical and emotional demands of their profession, created a state of chronic exhaustion that made self-care impossible. Morning brought no respite from the smells and squalor of the previous night. Women woke in the same clothes they had worked in, surrounded by the evidence of their night's labors. Without access to washing facilities or clean clothing, they faced each day carrying the accumulated filth of all the days before. Breakfast, if it existed at all, consisted of whatever scraps could be obtained cheaply or found discarded by others. Stale bread, spoiled fruit, and contaminated water provided minimal nutrition, while often contributing to the digestive problems that plagued most prostitutes. The workday began immediately after waking, with clients arriving at all hours seeking services. There was no time to prepare mentally or physically for each encounter, no opportunity to clean or rest between visitors. Women learned to dissociate mentally from their bodies, performing their duties while their minds retreated to safer places. Meals were catch-as-catch-can affairs, eaten hurriedly between clients or skipped entirely if business was too busy. The poor quality of available food, combined with the stress and trauma of their daily experiences, led to malnutrition and digestive disorders that further compromised their health and appearance. Evening brought no end to the work, as many clients preferred to visit brothels after dark. The oil lamps that provided light filled the air with smoke and created fire hazards, but they were essential for attracting customers and preventing complete darkness that would make work impossible. Sleep, when it finally came, was interrupted and unsatisfying. The combination of uncomfortable bedding, noise, parasites, and anxiety about the next day made rest elusive. Women learned to function on minimal sleep, but the chronic exhaustion took its toll on their immune systems and mental health. Each season brought its own particular forms of misery to the women trapped in Roman brothels. Spring offered no renewal or hope, only different challenges that had to be overcome with the same limited resources and worn-down bodies. Summer heat turned the poorly ventilated spaces into furnaces that concentrated every bad smell into an almost solid wall of stench. Clients became more irritable and violent in the heat, while the women themselves suffered from dehydration, heat exhaustion, and skin conditions that flourished in the humid, unwashed environment. The stone walls absorbed heat during the day and radiated it back at night, making sleep impossible even after the sun went down. Women learned to work despite feeling faint from the heat, as fainting meant lost income and potential punishment from brothel owners who cared nothing for their workers' physical limitations. Water became even more precious during heat waves, with prices rising to levels that made even basic drinking water a luxury. The little water that was available was often warm and stagnant, providing minimal relief and sometimes carrying diseases that spread quickly through the overcrowded facilities. Autumn brought temporary relief from the heat, but introduced new problems as the rainy season began. The poorly constructed buildings leaked constantly, creating puddles of stagnant water that became breeding grounds for insects and disease. The dampness made existing mold problems worse and created new ones in corners where water pooled and never dried. Winter was perhaps the cruelest season of all. The same stone walls that had trapped heat in summer now held the cold like ice. creating environments that were barely above freezing. Without adequate heating or warm clothing, women suffered from chilblains, frostbite, and respiratory infections that could quickly turn fatal. Working by lamplight made it impossible to see dirt and stains clearly, so women never knew how clean or dirty they actually were. The constant smoke from oil lamps during the long winter nights created a permanent haze that irritated eyes and lungs already compromised by poor living conditions. Roman society maintained complex and contradictory expectations for prostitutes that made their situation even more impossible to navigate. They were expected to be available and willing at all times, but also to maintain some semblance of attractiveness despite having no resources to do so. Clients wanted women who looked clean and appealing, but they also wanted to pay the lowest possible prices for services. This created an economic impossibility. Women needed money to buy soap, clean clothing, and other hygiene necessities, but they couldn't earn that money without already having those things to attract clients willing to pay decent rates. The legal system reflected these contradictions as well. Prostitutes were required to register with authorities and pay taxes on their earnings, but they were also denied most legal protections and rights. They were expected to contribute to society while being excluded from it, to follow laws that didn't protect them, and to maintain standards that were economically impossible to achieve. Religious authorities preached that prostitutes were necessary for social stability. They prevented adultery and rape by providing outlets for male sexual desires, but they also declared them morally contaminated and unworthy of salvation. This religious condemnation added spiritual suffering to their physical misery. Even other members of the lower classes looked down on prostitutes, grateful that their own poverty hadn't forced them to such extremes. This universal rejection meant that prostitutes had no allies, no advocates, and no hope of finding acceptance anywhere in Roman society. The standards applied to their appearance were particularly cruel. They were expected to look young, healthy, and attractive despite living in conditions that aged them rapidly and destroyed their health. Clients who paid a few copper coins expected the same level of beauty they might find in expensive courtesans, creating unrealistic expectations that could never be met. The economic ecosystem surrounding Roman brothels was populated by merchants, suppliers, and service providers who profited from the misery of the women while providing them with inferior goods at inflated prices. These businessmen understood that prostitutes were desperate customers who would pay anything for necessities, making them ideal targets for exploitation. Soap sellers in the Sabura district mixed their products with sand, ash, and other adulterants that made them cheaper to produce but harsher on the skin. Women who managed to save enough coins for soap often found that it caused more irritation than cleansing, leaving them worse off than before they had tried to clean themselves. Cloth merchants sold fabric so cheaply made that it fell apart after minimal use. The dyes were unstable and ran when wet, staining the wearer's skin in unnatural colors that marked them as users of the cheapest available goods. These clothing purchases, made with precious saved coins, often lasted only days before becoming unwearable. Food vendors understood that hungry prostitutes would buy anything edible, so they sold meat that was borderline spoiled, bread made with inferior grain, and wine that was mostly water mixed with vinegar. These merchants profited from desperation while contributing to the malnutrition and illness that plagued their customers. Water sellers charged premium prices for liquid that was often contaminated or of poor quality. They knew that thirsty, desperate women would pay any price rather than go without, and they took full advantage of this captive market. Clean water became a luxury that few could afford regularly. Even the brothel owners themselves were part of this exploitative ecosystem. They charged women for everything: rent for their cells, fees for oil lamps, costs for the minimal security provided, while keeping the vast majority of the earnings their bodies generated. The women were essentially sharecroppers, working someone else's land and equipment while receiving barely enough to survive. The Roman legal system was harsh and unforgiving, especially to people who already occupied the margins of society. Petty theft was common but dangerous. Women who were caught stealing faced severe punishments, including beatings, branding, or even execution depending on the value of what was stolen. But the temptation was often irresistible when the choice was between stealing soap and going without any cleaning supplies at all. Some women sold information about their clients to criminals who specialized in robbery or blackmail. This provided small amounts of extra income, but created the risk of violent retaliation if the clients discovered they had been betrayed. The fear of discovery added another layer of stress to lives already overwhelmed by anxiety and trauma. Drug dealing offered another source of income, as many clients sought opium, alcohol, or other substances to enhance their experiences or escape their own problems. But involvement in the drug trade brought the risk of severe legal penalties and violent conflicts with other dealers and suppliers. Illegal gambling operations sometimes employed prostitutes as dealers or attractions, providing small payments for women who were willing to take on additional risks. These gambling dens were frequently raided by authorities, and everyone present faced arrest and punishment regardless of their level of involvement. The underground economy also included various forms of fraud and confidence games that preyed on wealthy Romans looking for exotic experiences or rare goods. Prostitutes sometimes served as bait or accomplices in these schemes, earning small amounts of money while risking severe punishment if caught. Within the world of Roman prostitution, access to hygiene resources created its own hierarchy that determined not just comfort but survival chances. Women who managed to stay relatively clean lived longer, earned more money, and suffered less from disease and social rejection. At the very bottom were the street prostitutes who had no shelter, no access to water, and no protection from the elements. These women, often elderly or disabled former brothel workers, lived in doorways and alleys, selling their bodies for coins that barely bought survival for another day. Their appearance was so degraded that even other prostitutes avoided them. Slightly above them were the newest arrivals at the cheapest brothels, women who still maintained some hope and made efforts to stay clean despite their circumstances. These women still flinched at bad smells, still tried to wash when possible, and still believed that improving their hygiene might improve their situations. The middle tier consisted of experienced brothel workers who had learned to navigate their environment effectively. They knew which clients were most likely to be violent, which merchants sold the least adulterated goods, and how to acquire cleaning supplies through barter or theft when money wasn't available. Near the top of the prostitute hierarchy were women who had managed to establish relationships with regular clients who provided them with gifts of soap, clothing, or money. These relationships were precarious and could end suddenly, but while they lasted, they provided access to hygiene resources that made survival more bearable. At the very pinnacle were the few women who managed to accumulate enough resources to occasionally visit the public baths or purchase higher quality goods. These women were viewed with suspicion and envy by the others, who understood that such success was temporary and could disappear overnight. The gaps between these levels were vast, and movement between them was largely determined by factors beyond the women's control. The whims of clients, the policies of brothel owners, random acts of violence or disease. A woman could fall from the top tier to the bottom in a single day if she lost favor or contracted a visible illness. Prostitutes developed an extensive knowledge of improvised hygiene solutions created from whatever materials they could scavenge, steal, or afford. These makeshift remedies were often dangerous and ineffective, but they represented hope and agency in situations where both were rare commodities. Ashes from cooking fires were mixed with water to create harsh soaps that stripped skin of both dirt and protective oils. Women who used these mixtures regularly developed severe dermatitis and other skin conditions, but they continued using them because the alternative was complete uncleanliness. Vinegar, when it could be obtained, was used as a disinfectant and deodorant despite its harsh smell and tendency to burn damaged skin. Some women diluted it with water or wine to make it less caustic, but even diluted vinegar was painful to use on the cuts and sores that covered most prostitutes' bodies. Herbs and flowers were gathered from public spaces and used to create crude perfumes and deodorants. Rose petals were crushed and mixed with oil to mask body odors, while mint leaves were chewed to freshen breath. These remedies were largely ineffective, but provided psychological comfort to women who felt they were doing something to improve their situations. Sand and pumice stone were used to scrub away dirt and dead skin, creating abrasive treatments that often caused more damage than cleansing. Women who used these methods regularly developed scarred and leathery skin that was even less appealing to clients, but they continued the practice because it gave them a sense of control. Tranquil wine that had turned to vinegar was saved and used for cleaning wounds and washing hair. This reuse of spoiled alcohol provided some antiseptic benefit, but also contributed to the sour smell that clung to most prostitutes and marked them as members of the lowest social class. Urine was collected and aged until it developed ammonia, then used as a cleaning agent for both bodies and clothing. While this practice had some scientific basis, ammonia is indeed a cleaning agent. The social stigma of using urine made it a marker of extreme desperation. Each season brought its own epidemic diseases. that swept through the brothels with devastating effect. The combination of poor hygiene, malnutrition, overcrowding, and stress created perfect conditions for illness to spread rapidly among women whose immune systems were already compromised. Spring brought respiratory infections as the weather changed, and damp conditions promoted the growth of mold and bacteria. Women who had survived the winter in weakened condition were particularly vulnerable to these illnesses, which often developed into fatal pneumonia or consumption. Summer's heat created perfect conditions for food poisoning and digestive ailments. The lack of refrigeration meant that any food not consumed immediately began to spoil, and hungry women often ate contaminated provisions rather than go without. Dysentery and other intestinal diseases killed many women during the hottest months. Autumn rains brought flooding and standing water that became breeding grounds for insects and disease. Malaria and other mosquito-borne illnesses were common during this season, as were infections caused by contaminated water supplies that had been polluted by flood runoff. Winter's cold and dampness created conditions for fungal infections and respiratory diseases. The combination of poor nutrition, inadequate heating, and overcrowded living spaces made tuberculosis and other wasting diseases particularly deadly during the cold months. The changing seasons also affected the mental health of women who were already struggling with trauma and depression. The shorter days of winter and the oppressive heat of summer both contributed to the despair that claimed many lives through suicide or self-destructive behaviors. Medical care was virtually non-existent for prostitutes who were viewed as unworthy of treatment by most physicians. When women did receive medical attention, it was often from untrained individuals who provided remedies that were more harmful than helpful. The mental toll of living in constant filth and degradation was perhaps worse than the physical suffering, though the two were inextricably linked. Women who entered prostitution with intact self-esteem and hope for the future quickly learned that such luxuries were incompatible with survival in their new environment. The daily humiliation of being unable to stay clean created a form of learned helplessness that made escape seem impossible. Even when opportunities arose, women internalized the message that they were worthless and deserving of their fate, making it psychologically difficult to seek better circumstances. The constant exposure to violence and degradation created what modern psychologists would recognize as severe trauma responses. Women learned to dissociate from their bodies during work, retreating mentally to safer places while their physical selves endured whatever was required for survival. Women lost interest in food, sleep, and personal care beyond the absolute minimum required to continue earning money. This depression often manifested as a flat, emotionless demeanor that clients found disturbing but were too selfish to address. Anxiety and hypervigilance were also common, as women learned to constantly scan their environment for threats. The inability to ever feel safe or secure created a chronic stress response that weakened immune systems and contributed to the many physical ailments that plagued the population. Some women developed what appeared to be multiple personalities or other dissociative disorders as ways of coping with trauma that exceeded their psychological resources. These mental breaks from reality were often the only way to preserve some small part of the self from complete destruction. Substance abuse was rampant among prostitutes who had access to alcohol or drugs. These substances provided temporary escape from physical pain and emotional trauma, but they also contributed to poor decision-making and increased vulnerability to violence and exploitation. Disease wasn't just a health problem for Roman prostitutes, it was an economic disaster that could destroy any hope of survival or escape. Women who became visibly ill lost clients immediately, as even the least discriminating customers avoided those who showed obvious signs of infection or disease. Skin diseases were particularly devastating because they were impossible to hide. Rashes, sores, and other visible conditions marked women as diseased and untouchable, eliminating their ability to earn money at precisely the moment when they needed resources most desperately for treatment. Sexually transmitted diseases created a vicious cycle where the conditions that caused illness also prevented treatment. Women needed money to buy remedies, but their illness prevented them from earning money, leaving them trapped in deteriorating situations with no hope of recovery. The financial costs of even basic remedies were prohibitive for women who earned barely enough for survival. A single dose of medicine might cost more than a prostitute earned in a week, making treatment economically impossible even when it was medically available. Brothel owners had no incentive to provide medical care for their workers, as replacing a sick woman was cheaper than treating her illness. This economic calculation meant that disease was essentially a death sentence for most prostitutes who were abandoned to die when they became too ill to generate profits. The fear of disease created additional economic pressures as women competed desperately to avoid the appearance of illness. Those who looked healthy, even if they weren't, could command higher prices and better treatment, while those who showed any signs of disease were relegated to serving the poorest and most dangerous clients. Some women tried to hide their illnesses with cosmetics and perfumes, but these efforts often made their conditions worse while draining resources they needed for food and shelter. The pressure to appear healthy when sick created additional stress and suffering that accelerated their decline. Roman medicine, primitive by modern standards, was even less effective when applied to the diseases and conditions that plagued prostitutes. The treatments available were often more harmful than helpful, and the practitioners who might have provided them usually refused to treat women from the lowest social class. Bloodletting was a common treatment for many conditions, based on the theory that illness was caused by an imbalance of bodily fluids. For malnourished women who were already weakened by poor living conditions, the loss of blood often proved fatal rather than curative. Purging with harsh laxatives was another standard treatment that could be devastating to women who were already suffering from malnutrition and dehydration. These treatments often caused severe electrolyte imbalances that led to heart problems and death. Trepanation, the practice of drilling holes in the skull to treat mental illness, was sometimes performed on prostitutes who displayed what were considered abnormal behaviors. This primitive surgery was usually fatal and was performed without any understanding of brain function or proper surgical techniques. Various poisons were used as medicines, including mercury for skin conditions and antimony for eye problems. These toxic substances often caused more harm than the original conditions they were meant to treat, adding heavy metal poisoning to the list of health problems facing prostitutes. Cauterization with hot irons was used to treat everything from infections to mental illness, creating painful burns that often became infected themselves. The shock and trauma of these procedures killed many women who might have survived their original conditions with different treatment. Religious healing was sometimes attempted, but prostitutes were generally considered too corrupted for divine intervention. The few religious healers who were willing to treat them usually focused on moral reform rather than medical treatment, providing little help for physical ailments. The physical design of Roman brothels was deliberately constructed to reinforce the degraded status of the women who worked there. Every aspect of the architecture sent a clear message about the value placed on these women's lives and comfort. Ceilings were deliberately low to create feelings of oppression and confinement. The cramped spaces made it impossible for women to stand upright in many areas, forcing them to remain in submissive postures that reinforced their low status. These low ceilings also trapped heat, smoke, and odors, making the air quality even worse. Corridors were narrow and maze-like, designed to confuse clients who might be drunk or disoriented, while also making escape difficult for women who might attempt to flee. The confusing layout also made it easy for brothel owners to control movement within the building and monitor the activities of their workers. Windows were small and placed high on walls where they provided minimal light and no opportunity for the women inside to see the outside world. These tiny openings were often barred or shuttered, creating prison-like conditions that emphasized the captivity of the inhabitants. Doors were flimsy and provided no real privacy, but they were fitted with strong locks that could be used to imprison women who were considered flight risks or who had fallen out of favor with the management. The message was clear: you can be locked in, but you cannot lock others out. Floors were usually dirt or rough stone that was impossible to keep clean and comfortable. These surfaces absorbed every spill and stain, becoming repositories of filth that contributed to the overall unhealthy environment. The discomfort of these floors made rest difficult and reinforced the message that comfort was not a consideration. Decoration was minimal and degrading, often consisting of crude paintings that emphasized the sexual nature of the activities taking place. These images served to dehumanize the women and reduce them to their sexual functions in the minds of both clients and the women themselves. Access to clean water was perhaps the single most important factor determining the hygiene and health of Roman prostitutes, and it was the resource they were least likely to obtain in adequate quantities. The famous Roman aqueduct system that brought fresh water to the city's public fountains and wealthy neighborhoods might as well have been on another planet for women trapped in the Sabura's brothels. Water had to be carried by hand from public fountains that were often miles away from the districts where prostitutes worked. The physical effort required to transport heavy amphorae filled with water was beyond the capabilities of many women who were weakened by malnutrition and disease. Those who were strong enough to make the journey found that the water they carried was often contaminated by the time they returned. They often ran dry during peak usage times, forcing people to wait hours for a chance to fill their containers. The water that did flow was frequently polluted by upstream contamination or lead poisoning from the pipes that carried it through the city. Private wells existed in some areas, but they were controlled by property owners who charged high prices for access. These wells were often contaminated by sewage and other pollutants that seeped through the soil, making them dangerous sources of waterborne diseases like cholera and dysentery. Water merchants traveled through the poor districts selling liquid that was supposedly clean, but their practices were unregulated and their products were often as contaminated as the free water available elsewhere. The desperation of their customers made quality control unnecessary. People would buy anything liquid when they were thirsty enough. Storage was another major problem for prostitutes who managed to obtain clean water. Without proper containers or secure storage areas, water quickly became contaminated by insects, dust, and other pollutants. The vessels available to the poor were usually made from porous clay that absorbed odors and bacteria, making them unsuitable for storing drinking water. The price of water fluctuated with supply and demand, rising dramatically during droughts and heat waves when it was needed most desperately. Women who had barely enough money for food found themselves choosing between eating and drinking, often leading to dehydration that made their other health problems worse. The clothing worn by Roman prostitutes was perhaps the most visible marker of their degraded status and the most immediate contributor to their hygiene problems. Unlike the fine togas and stolas worn by respectable Romans, prostitutes were forced to make do with the cheapest available fabrics that quickly became repositories of dirt, sweat, and odors. Most prostitutes owned only one or two garments which had to serve multiple functions: work clothes, sleeping attire, and streetwear, all rolled into one. These clothes were worn continuously for weeks or months at a time, absorbing every smell and stain encountered during that period. The fabrics became so saturated with odors that no amount of washing could restore them to cleanliness. The quality of fabric available to prostitutes was deliberately inferior, made from scraps and offcuts that reputable merchants couldn't sell elsewhere. These fabrics were often poorly dyed, with colors that ran when wet and stained the wearer's skin in unnatural hues. The dyes themselves were sometimes toxic, causing rashes and other skin problems for women who wore them regularly. Undergarments, as Romans understood them, were minimal and often non-existent among the poorest prostitutes. The lack of underclothing meant that outer garments came into direct contact with the body, absorbing every secretion and odor. This made maintaining any level of cleanliness virtually impossible, as the clothes became extensions of the unwashed body. Washing clothes required resources that most prostitutes didn't have: clean water, soap, time, and a place to dry wet garments. Even when these resources were available, the act of washing often destroyed the cheap fabrics or caused the unstable dyes to run, making the clothes unwearable. Many women chose to wear dirty clothes rather than risk destroying their only possessions. Mending torn clothing was a constant necessity, but it required materials and skills that many prostitutes lacked. Needle and thread were expensive luxuries, and the knowledge of how to repair fabric properly was not universal. Clothes were often held together with crude patches and knots that made them even less attractive and comfortable. The style of clothing worn by prostitutes was dictated by law and custom, designed to mark them as members of the lowest social class. They were forbidden from wearing the respectable garments of citizen women and were required to dress in ways that made their profession obvious to observers. This legal requirement for degrading dress added another layer of humiliation to their daily existence. Roman society maintained contradictory expectations for prostitutes that made their situation even more impossible to navigate successfully. They were expected to be clean enough to attract clients, but not so clean as to appear to be rising above their station. They were required to be available and appealing, but were denied access to the resources that would make appeal possible. Clients wanted women who looked fresh and attractive, but they also expected to pay bargain prices for services. This created an economic paradox. Women needed money to buy hygiene supplies and attractive clothing, but they couldn't earn that money without already possessing those things to attract paying customers. The legal requirements for prostitutes included registration with authorities and payment of taxes, but these same laws denied them most civil rights and legal protections. They were expected to contribute to society while being excluded from its benefits, to follow regulations that provided them no security, and to maintain standards that were economically impossible to achieve. Religious authorities preached that prostitutes served important social functions by preventing adultery and providing outlets for male desires, but they also declared these women morally contaminated and spiritually beyond redemption. This religious condemnation added guilt and shame to the already overwhelming burden of physical suffering. Even within the brothel hierarchy, standards were applied inconsistently and unfairly. A woman might be punished for appearing too dirty, but if she managed to look too clean, she could be accused of theft or of trying to attract clients away from other workers. The constantly shifting expectations made it impossible to find a safe middle ground. The standards applied to behavior were equally contradictory. Prostitutes were expected to be compliant and willing with clients, but assertive and competitive with other workers. They had to appear experienced enough to provide satisfactory services, but innocent enough to appeal to clients who preferred the illusion of corruption. The complete exclusion of prostitutes from respectable Roman society created a form of social death that was often more devastating than their physical sufferings. They became invisible people, recognized only for their sexual functions, and denied any other form of human identity or dignity. Free Roman women avoided them entirely, viewing prostitutes as sources of moral contamination who could pollute respectable women through mere proximity. Even brief contact with a known prostitute could damage a free woman's reputation, so they crossed streets to avoid encounters and refused to acknowledge their existence. Children were taught to fear and despise prostitutes from an early age, learning to throw stones and shout insults at women whose only crime was poverty and desperation. This early indoctrination ensured that the next generation would maintain the same attitudes of hatred and contempt that trapped women in cycles of degradation. Religious institutions offered no comfort or spiritual support, viewing prostitutes as willing participants in sin rather than victims of circumstance. They were barred from most temples and religious ceremonies, cutting them off from the community connections and spiritual comfort that helped other Romans cope with life's difficulties. The legal system treated prostitutes as non-persons, whose testimony was worthless and whose complaints were ignored. They could be robbed, beaten, or killed with minimal consequences for the perpetrators, as their lives were considered to have no value in the eyes of the law. Even other members of the lower classes looked down on prostitutes, grateful that their own poverty hadn't forced them to such extremes. This meant that prostitutes had no allies anywhere in society, no group that might advocate for their interests or provide mutual support. The isolation was so complete that many prostitutes internalized the hatred directed at them, coming to believe that they truly were worthless and deserving of their fate. This psychological destruction often proved more devastating than the physical abuse, as it eliminated hope and made escape seem impossible. Even when opportunities arose, they died as they had lived in filth, pain, and abandonment, with no one to mourn their passing or remember their humanity. The process of dying was often prolonged and agonizing, as disease and malnutrition slowly consumed bodies that had been weakened by years of abuse and neglect. There were no deathbed comforts for women who had spent their lives providing comfort to others. No clean sheets, no gentle nursing, no friends or family to ease the transition from life to death. They died surrounded by the same squalor they had endured in life, often in the same cells where they had worked, with the sounds of ongoing business echoing around them. Medical care was non-existent for dying prostitutes who were considered unworthy of the expense and effort required for treatment. Even when remedies existed that might have saved their lives, they were denied access to them because of their social status. They were left to suffer and die without even the minimal comfort of pain relief. The bodies of dead prostitutes were disposed of with the same lack of care they had received in life. They were wrapped in whatever scraps of cloth were available and buried in unmarked graves in areas reserved for society's unwanted dead. No prayers were said, no ceremonies performed, no monuments erected to mark their existence. Their personal possessions, such as they were immediately claimed by other women who needed whatever small comforts could be salvaged. A comb, a piece of jewelry, a cleaner garment. These tiny treasures were redistributed among the living, who understood that they too would someday face the same anonymous end. The rooms where they had died were quickly cleaned and prepared for new occupants, as business could not be interrupted by sentiment or mourning. Within days, it was as if they had never existed, their places taken by new arrivals who would follow the same path from hope to despair to death. Even in death, their bodies carried the accumulated filth and odors of their lives, marking them as prostitutes even after their struggles had ended. They were buried unwashed and unanointed, without the dignity accorded to even the poorest citizens who had maintained their respectability. But death was not the end of the story for these women. Their bodies, discarded in unmarked graves, continued to tell tales of the horrors they had endured. The soil around these burial sites became contaminated with the diseases they had carried, creating health hazards for anyone unfortunate enough to disturb these resting places years later. The brothels themselves became monuments to human suffering, their walls permanently stained with the evidence of countless lives destroyed by systematic neglect. Long after the last prostitute had died or been replaced, these buildings continued to reek of human misery. The stone had absorbed decades of sweat, blood, and tears, creating an olfactory memory that would persist for generations. Archaeological evidence from these sites tells a story that ancient historians preferred to ignore. Layers of human waste, discarded clothing, and personal items reveal the true conditions in which these women lived and died. Modern excavations uncover combs with missing teeth, broken mirrors, and crude cosmetic containers that speak to the desperate attempts these women made to maintain some semblance of dignity. The diseases that flourished in these environments didn't stay contained within the brothel walls. They spread throughout the surrounding neighborhoods, carried by clients who visited multiple establishments and then returned to their homes and families. The poor hygiene of prostitutes became a public health crisis that affected all levels of Roman society. Medical texts from the period when they mention prostitutes at all describe them as sources of contagion and disease. Physicians warned against contact with these women not out of moral concern, but from genuine fear of the infections they carried. The medical establishment essentially wrote off an entire class of people as untreatable and dangerous. The children born to prostitutes inherited more than just their mother's social status. They inherited the physical consequences of lives lived in filth and degradation. These children were often born prematurely, underweight, and already infected with the diseases that had plagued their mothers. Their chances of survival were minimal, and those who did live faced the same cycle of poverty and disease that had destroyed their parents. The few children who survived infancy often displayed the physical and mental effects of their prenatal exposure to malnutrition, disease, and toxic substances. They grew up stunted, both physically and intellectually, carrying visible markers of their origins that made escape from their circumstances nearly impossible. These children, when they reached working age, often found themselves following in their mother's footsteps. The boys might become criminals or day laborers, while the girls frequently ended up in the same brothels where their mothers had worked. The cycle of degradation continued across generations, with each new cohort facing the same impossible hygiene challenges. The broader Roman economy was affected by this systematic waste of human resources. Thousands of women who might have contributed to society as workers, mothers, or citizens were instead trapped in conditions that destroyed their health and productivity. The economic loss represented by their shortened lives and reduced capabilities was enormous, though it was never calculated by Roman economists. Roman authorities were well aware of the conditions in the brothels, but their responses focused on containment rather than improvement. Laws were passed requiring prostitutes to live and work in specific districts, effectively creating ghettos where poor sanitation and disease could be concentrated and hopefully contained. They created official records that could be used to track disease outbreaks and identify women who might be spreading infections. These records also served to permanently mark women as prostitutes, making it nearly impossible for them to escape their circumstances, even if they somehow acquired the resources to do so. Public health measures, such as they existed, explicitly excluded prostitutes from consideration. The public baths that were a source of pride for Roman civilization were closed to women of this class, ensuring that they remained trapped in their unsanitary conditions. Even the public latrines were often off-limits to prostitutes, forcing them to find other solutions for their basic needs. The military, which relied heavily on prostitutes for the entertainment of soldiers, implemented some basic health screening procedures, but these were designed to protect the soldiers rather than the women. Prostitutes who showed obvious signs of disease were simply removed from service and replaced with no consideration for their treatment or welfare. Legal reforms occasionally addressed the prostitution trade, but these changes focused on taxation, regulation, and moral control rather than the living conditions of the women involved. No Roman law ever required brothel owners to provide clean water, adequate food, or basic medical care for their workers. These underground systems helped women navigate the dangerous world they inhabited and provided some small measure of protection against the worst abuses. Experienced prostitutes taught newcomers the basic survival skills needed to endure their circumstances. This informal education included not just techniques for avoiding violent clients and managing money, but also crude medical knowledge about treating common ailments and infections with whatever materials were available. Networks of former prostitutes sometimes provided assistance to women still trapped in the trade. These women, who had managed to escape through marriage, the death of an owner, or simple luck, understood the challenges faced by those still working, and occasionally provided help in the form of money, supplies, or information about safer working conditions. Religious minorities sometimes offered aid to prostitutes, viewing them as souls worthy of salvation, rather than sources of contamination. These groups operated in secrecy, as helping prostitutes was often seen as encouraging sin, but they provided some of the only organized assistance available to these women. Black market medical practitioners served the prostitute community, offering treatments that were often dangerous but were the only options available to women who couldn't afford legitimate physicians. These practitioners operated outside the law and provided services of questionable quality, but they at least acknowledged that prostitutes were human beings worthy of medical attention. Information networks helped women identify the safest brothels, the least violent clients, and the most reliable sources for basic necessities. This underground intelligence system was crucial for survival in an environment where making the wrong choice could mean the difference between life and death. The existence of these degraded women served important psychological functions for Roman society as a whole. They provided a clear example of what happened to women who fell outside the protection of family and social structures, serving as a warning to other women about the importance of maintaining respectability. The contrast between the filthy, diseased prostitutes and the clean, well-groomed matrons of respectable families reinforced social hierarchies and cultural values. The visible degradation of prostitutes made the privileges of citizenship and social status seem more valuable by comparison. Literature and art occasionally depicted prostitutes, but these portrayals focused on their moral corruption rather than their physical suffering. The reality of their hygiene problems was considered too crude for artistic treatment, so their true conditions remained largely undocumented in the cultural record. Religious teachings used prostitutes as examples of the consequences of sin and moral failure. Their physical degradation was presented as evidence of spiritual corruption, reinforcing the belief that people deserved whatever circumstances they found themselves in. The medical understanding of disease was influenced by observations of prostitutes, but in ways that reinforced rather than challenged social prejudices. Physicians concluded that certain diseases were associated with moral failings rather than recognizing the role that poor living conditions played in their development. The prostitution industry generated enormous profits for everyone involved except the women who provided the actual services. Brothel owners, tax collectors, suppliers, and various service providers all benefited from a system that systematically exploited vulnerable women while denying them the resources needed for basic survival. The slave trade that supplied many brothels was a lucrative business that connected the Roman economy to conflicts across the known world. Military campaigns were partially funded by the expectation that captives would be sold into sexual slavery, creating economic incentives for warfare and conquest. The taxation of prostitution provided significant revenue for local governments, giving officials a financial stake in maintaining the industry. This economic dependence made reform unlikely, as improving conditions for prostitutes would have required reducing the profitability that supported the entire system. Suppliers of goods and services to the prostitution industry charged premium prices for inferior products, understanding that their customers had no alternative sources and would pay anything for basic necessities. This exploitation extended the economic abuse beyond the brothels themselves into the broader commercial network. The construction and maintenance of brothels provided employment for various craftsmen and laborers, creating additional economic interests in preserving the system. These workers had no direct contact with the prostitutes themselves but depended on the industry for their livelihoods. The diseases that flourished in Roman brothels created medical puzzles that challenged the primitive understanding of illness and infection available at the time. Physicians observed patterns of disease that they couldn't explain using the theoretical frameworks of ancient medicine. The concentration of certain illnesses in the prostitute population led some medical observers to conclude that moral behavior influenced physical health. This moral theory of disease reinforced social prejudices, while preventing the development of more effective treatments based on environmental factors. Some physicians did recognize the connection between living conditions and disease rates, but their observations were largely ignored by a medical establishment that preferred explanations based on humoral theory and moral corruption. The few doctors who advocated for improved sanitation were dismissed as radicals who misunderstood the nature of disease. Experimental treatments were sometimes tested on prostitutes without their consent, as they were considered to have no rights and their lives were viewed as expendable. These early medical experiments provided some useful knowledge, but at the cost of tremendous suffering for women who were already enduring more than any human should. The anatomical knowledge gained from the bodies of dead prostitutes contributed to medical understanding, but this knowledge came at the cost of human dignity. The bodies of these women became teaching tools for physicians who had refused to treat them while they were alive. The systematic dehumanization of prostitutes raised philosophical questions about the nature of human worth and dignity that Roman intellectuals largely chose to ignore. The contradiction between Roman ideals of justice and civilization and the treatment of these women was rarely addressed in philosophical writings. Some philosophers did grapple with questions about slavery and human dignity, but their discussions typically excluded prostitutes from consideration. These women were seen as having forfeited their claim to human consideration through their actions, making them philosophically invisible. The Stoic emphasis on accepting one's circumstances was sometimes used to justify the suffering of prostitutes, suggesting that they were experiencing the natural consequences of their choices. This philosophical framework absolved society of any responsibility for improving their conditions. Religious philosophers struggled with questions about redemption and salvation as they applied to prostitutes. While some argued that all souls could be saved, others maintained that certain actions placed people beyond the reach of divine mercy. The legal tradition that developed around prostitution reflected deeper philosophical assumptions about human nature, social order, and the relationship between private behavior and public good. These legal frameworks institutionalized the degradation of prostitutes and made their suffering a matter of law rather than circumstance. Every day brought new challenges as prostitutes tried to navigate the complex social and economic relationships that determined their survival. They had to balance competing demands from clients, brothel owners, other workers, and local authorities, all while maintaining enough physical and mental health to continue working. The negotiation of basic hygiene resources required sophisticated social skills and strategic thinking. A woman might trade sexual services for soap, barter information for access to clean water, or form temporary alliances with other workers to pool resources for common necessities. A client who provided gifts of money or hygiene supplies could make the difference between life and death, but becoming too dependent on any individual created vulnerabilities that could be exploited. Alliances formed and dissolved based on changing circumstances, and women had to constantly assess the loyalty and trustworthiness of those around them. Betrayal was common and could have devastating consequences. Managing relationships with brothel owners required a delicate balance between compliance and self-preservation. Too much resistance could result in punishment or expulsion, but complete submission often led to increased exploitation and abuse. The changing seasons brought predictable patterns of hardship that prostitutes learned to anticipate and prepare for as much as their limited resources allowed. Each season had its own particular challenges that tested their ability to survive in already impossible conditions. Spring brought hope for better conditions, but also increased competition as new women arrived in the city looking for work. The mild weather made outdoor activities more pleasant, but also brought seasonal allergies and respiratory problems for women whose immune systems were already compromised. Summer's heat created the worst conditions of the year, with temperatures that could kill weakened individuals and humidity that made every smell more intense. The demand for services often increased during summer months as soldiers returned from campaigns and festivals brought visitors to the city. Autumn provided temporary relief from summer's extremes but also brought uncertainty about winter preparations. Women who had managed to save small amounts of money or supplies during the more prosperous summer months had to decide how to allocate these resources for the harsh months ahead. Winter was the season of death for many prostitutes. as the combination of cold, dampness, poor nutrition, and weakened immune systems created conditions that many could not survive. The reduced business during winter months made it even harder to earn money for food and fuel. The cycle repeated year after year, with each season bringing its own forms of suffering and small opportunities for improvement. Women who survived multiple cycles developed hard-won expertise in managing these seasonal challenges, but the fundamental problems remained unchanged. Within the world of Roman prostitution, subtle distinctions in status and resources created hierarchies based on access to basic necessities, like clean water, soap, and adequate food. These hierarchies were constantly shifting as women's circumstances changed, but they had profound effects on survival rates and quality of life. At the very bottom were the street prostitutes who had no shelter, no regular access to water, and no protection from weather or violence. These women, often the oldest or most diseased, lived day to day on whatever coins they could earn, with no hope of improving their circumstances. Slightly above them were the newest arrivals at the cheapest brothels, women who still retained some hope and made efforts to maintain their appearance despite the impossible conditions. These women were often the most vulnerable to exploitation, as they had not yet learned the survival skills necessary for their environment. The middle tier consisted of experienced brothel workers who had learned to navigate their dangerous world effectively. They knew which clients to avoid, which other workers could be trusted, and how to acquire the resources necessary for minimal survival. Near the top of the prostitute hierarchy were women who had managed to establish relationships with regular clients or had accumulated small amounts of money or possessions. These advantages were precarious and could disappear overnight, but while they lasted, they provided access to better hygiene resources. At the very pinnacle were the few women who had managed to work in better establishments or attract wealthier clientele. Even these women faced conditions that would be considered intolerable by any reasonable standard, but their relative privilege made them objects of envy and resentment among other prostitutes. The competition between different levels of this hierarchy often prevented cooperation and mutual aid that might have improved conditions for everyone. Women were forced to compete for the few resources available rather than working together to demand better treatment. The effects of the systematic degradation experienced by Roman prostitutes extended far beyond their own lifespans, creating patterns of trauma and dysfunction that affected multiple generations. The children who grew up in and around brothels inherited not just poverty but entire worldviews shaped by violence, exploitation, and human degradation. Mothers who had been brutalized and dehumanized struggled to provide emotional nurturing to their children, even when they desperately wanted to break the cycle of abuse. The constant stress and trauma they experienced made it difficult to form healthy attachments or to model positive relationships. Children who witnessed the daily humiliation of their mothers developed complex psychological responses to power, sexuality, and human relationships. Many became hypervigilant about potential threats, while others learned to dissociate from their emotions as a survival mechanism. The normalization of violence and exploitation in the brothel environment taught children that humans could be bought, sold, and discarded when they were no longer useful. This early education in human disposability shaped their later relationships and their understanding of their own worth. The lack of stable male role models meant that children often had distorted views of masculinity based on their observations of clients and brothel owners. They learned to associate manhood with violence, sexual exploitation, and the purchase of human beings. Educational opportunities were non-existent for children born into the prostitution world, as they were considered inherently corrupted and unsuitable for normal schooling. This denial of education ensured that they would remain trapped in the same cycle of poverty and exploitation that had claimed their parents. The health problems that affected prostitutes were often passed on to their children through malnutrition, disease transmission, and exposure to toxic substances. Many children were born with developmental disabilities or chronic health conditions that made normal life impossible. Despite the overwhelming oppression they faced, some prostitutes managed to create networks of resistance and mutual aid that provided alternatives to complete despair. These networks operated in secrecy and faced constant threats of discovery and punishment, but they represented important attempts to maintain human dignity in the face of systematic dehumanization. Underground communication systems allowed women to share information about dangerous clients, corrupt officials, and opportunities for escape or improvement. This information network was crucial for survival in an environment where making the wrong choice could be fatal. Some former prostitutes who had managed to escape their circumstances returned to help others, providing money, supplies, or simply emotional support to women who were still trapped. These acts of compassion were dangerous for both the givers and receivers, but they represented important assertions of human solidarity. Religious groups that worked with prostitutes sometimes provided not just spiritual comfort but practical assistance in the form of food, medicine, and shelter. These groups operated outside mainstream religious institutions and faced persecution for their efforts to help society's outcasts. Economic cooperatives allowed groups of prostitutes to pool their meager resources to purchase better supplies or rent safer working spaces. These arrangements required enormous trust and cooperation among women who had been taught to see each other as competition. Escape networks helped women flee abusive situations and find alternative means of survival. These networks were necessarily small and secretive, as discovery meant severe punishment for everyone involved, but they provided hope for women who might otherwise have had none. The preservation of cultural traditions and personal histories provided another form of resistance against the complete erasure of identity that the system attempted to impose. Women shared songs, stories, and memories that connected them to lives they had lived before prostitution and identities beyond their current circumstances. The mathematics of survival for Roman prostitutes revealed the systematic nature of their exploitation and the impossibility of escape through individual effort. Every aspect of their economic situation was designed to keep them trapped in cycles of debt and dependence that made improvement impossible. A typical transaction might earn a woman enough coins to buy half a day's food, but after the brothel owner's commission, taxes, and fees for lodging and security, she might be left with barely enough for a single meal. The idea of saving money for hygiene supplies or improved clothing was laughable when basic survival was uncertain. The prices charged for necessities in districts where prostitutes lived were inflated far above those in respectable neighborhoods. Merchants understood that they had a captive market of desperate customers who would pay any price for essential goods, and they exploited this advantage ruthlessly. Debt peonage was common, as brothel owners provided advances for food, clothing, and lodging that had to be repaid with interest from future earnings. These debts were calculated in ways that ensured they could never be fully repaid, creating permanent financial obligations that bound women to their exploiters. The seasonal nature of demand meant that income was unpredictable and often insufficient during slow periods. Women might earn relatively well during festivals or when military units were in town, but these periods of increased income were followed by longer stretches of near starvation. Hidden costs ate away at whatever small profits women might have made. They were charged for everything from lamp oil to laundry services, and these fees were often inflated beyond any reasonable relationship to actual costs. The brothel owners profited from every aspect of their workers' lives. The lack of access to banking or credit systems meant that prostitutes had no way to save money safely or invest in improvements to their situations. Any accumulated wealth was vulnerable to theft, confiscation, or emergency spending for medical care or basic survival. The bodies of living and dead prostitutes provided opportunities for medical experimentation and anatomical study that would have been impossible to conduct on citizens of higher social status. These practices advanced medical knowledge, but at the cost of tremendous suffering for women who had no legal recourse or protection. Experimental treatments for venereal diseases were often tested on prostitutes without their consent or knowledge. These experiments were crude by modern standards and often caused more harm than benefit, but they provided physicians with information about disease progression and treatment effects. Surgical procedures were practiced on prostitutes who could not afford proper medical care, allowing physicians to develop their skills on patients whose survival was considered unimportant. These practice surgeries were often performed without adequate anesthesia or sterile conditions, resulting in high mortality rates. Anatomical dissections of prostitutes' bodies provided medical schools with teaching materials and advanced the understanding of human anatomy and disease. While this knowledge was valuable, it was obtained through the systematic dehumanization of women, whose bodies became commodities even in death. Pregnancy and childbirth among prostitutes were studied to understand reproductive medicine, but this research focused on the biological processes rather than the welfare of the mothers or children involved. The high rates of maternal and infant mortality in this population provided abundant opportunities for study. Mental health conditions that were common among prostitutes were observed and documented, but the treatments attempted were often more harmful than helpful. The lack of understanding about trauma and psychological disorders meant that interventions often increased rather than relieved suffering. The documentation of diseases and conditions that affected prostitutes provided important epidemiological data, but this information was used to justify their isolation and exclusion rather than to develop effective treatments or prevention strategies. Even in death, prostitutes faced indignities that reflected their complete exclusion from human consideration. Their bodies were disposed of with less care than would be given to animals, and their deaths were recorded, if at all, as simple statistics rather than human tragedies. The dying process itself was often prolonged and agonizing, as women who had been weakened by years of abuse and neglect succumbed slowly to diseases that might have been treatable under different circumstances. They died without comfort, without dignity, and often without anyone to witness their passing. Burial practices for prostitutes reflected their social status in death as in life. They were interred in mass graves with other social outcasts, without individual markers or ceremonies. Their bodies were wrapped in whatever scraps of cloth were available, often the same filthy garments they had worn while working. The location of these burial sites was deliberately chosen to be as far as possible from respectable cemeteries, ensuring that even in death, prostitutes would not contaminate the moral atmosphere surrounding citizens' graves. These burial grounds became associated with disease and moral corruption. The personal possessions of dead prostitutes were immediately redistributed among the living, as no one had any claim to inherit their meager belongings. The few items that marked their individual identities, a broken comb, a piece of jewelry, a letter from home, were scattered and lost within hours of their deaths. No records were kept of their names, origins, or personal histories. They had lived as anonymous bodies for rent, and they died as anonymous corpses for disposal. The systematic erasure of their identities was complete, as if they had never existed as individual human beings. The diseases they had carried in life continued to affect their burial sites, contaminating the soil and groundwater in ways that created health hazards for future generations. Even in death, they were seen as sources of pollution rather than as victims worthy of proper care. The system that created and maintained these conditions was self-perpetuating, constantly generating new victims to replace those who died or escaped. The fundamental economic and social structures that made such exploitation possible remained unchanged throughout the centuries of Roman rule. New arrivals at the brothels faced the same impossible choices that had confronted thousands of women before them. They could accept the gradual destruction of their health and dignity in exchange for basic survival, or they could refuse and face immediate starvation and homelessness. The occasional reforms that were proposed or implemented focused on regulation and taxation rather than the fundamental conditions that made human dignity impossible to maintain. These changes often made conditions worse for the women while improving the efficiency of their exploitation. The normalization of extreme suffering meant that each generation of prostitutes accepted conditions that would have shocked their predecessors. The baseline for what constituted tolerable treatment continued to decline as society became accustomed to ever greater levels of human degradation. The profit margins generated by this system were so enormous that those who benefited from it had every incentive to preserve and expand it rather than reform it. The economic interests that supported the prostitution industry were deeply embedded in Roman society and politics. The cultural attitudes that justified this treatment of vulnerable women were reinforced by religious, philosophical, and legal traditions that portrayed their suffering as natural and inevitable. These ideological supports made reform seem not just unnecessary but actually harmful to social order. The international scope of the slave trade that supplied many brothels meant that the system was constantly being replenished with new victims from across the known world. Military conquest provided a steady stream of captive women who could be processed through the system of sexual exploitation. And so the nightmare continued, generation after generation, with each cohort of women facing the same impossible struggle to maintain human dignity in conditions designed to destroy it. The Roman Empire built its monuments and celebrated its achievements while systematically destroying the lives of thousands of women whose only crime was vulnerability in a world that showed no mercy to the powerless. The stench that filled those narrow corridors in the Sabura was more than just the product of poor hygiene and overcrowding. It was the smell of human souls being systematically destroyed, of dignity being ground into dust, of hope being extinguished one woman at a time. It was the smell of a civilization that measured its greatness by the height of its buildings while ignoring the depth of its moral failures. Tonight, as you drift off to sleep in your clean bed with running water just steps away, Remember that the distance between our world and theirs is measured not just in centuries, but in fundamental changes in how we understand human worth and dignity. The women whose stories we've shared deserve to be remembered not just as statistics of ancient brutality, but as individual human beings who endured unimaginable suffering while trying to maintain whatever small shreds of humanity they could preserve. Their legacy is not just in the archaeological remains of their living spaces or the medical texts that documented their diseases. Their legacy lives on in the stones themselves, in the very foundations of buildings that still stand today, soaked with the memories of human suffering that most visitors never imagine. Modern excavations of Roman brothel sites reveal layer upon layer of accumulated filth that tells the story of these women's lives more clearly than any written account. The soil samples taken from these locations show concentrations of human waste, parasites and disease organisms that paint a vivid picture of the sanitary conditions these women endured. The stone floors of these ancient buildings still bear stains that laboratory analysis reveals to be human blood, mixed with other bodily fluids that have soaked so deeply into the porous limestone that they have become part of the rock itself. These stains create dark patterns that archaeologists can map and study, revealing the locations where the worst suffering took place. Bone analysis of skeletal remains found in prostitute burial sites shows evidence of malnutrition, disease, and physical trauma that speaks to lives of constant hardship. The bones themselves tell stories of broken ribs that healed poorly, indicating violent treatment, and nutritional deficiencies that stunted growth and weakened immune systems. Textile fragments recovered from these sites show the poor quality of fabrics these women wore, with crude repairs and staining that no amount of washing could remove. The dyes used in these cheap fabrics often contain toxic substances that would have caused skin irritation and allergic reactions in women whose skin was already compromised by poor hygiene. Personal items found in these excavations, broken combs, cracked mirrors, crude cosmetic containers, reveal the desperate attempts these women made to maintain some semblance of personal care despite their circumstances. The wear patterns on these objects show heavy use and repeated repairs, indicating how precious even the most basic grooming tools were to women who had nothing else. Parasite eggs preserved in the ancient latrines and waste deposits show the incredible burden of intestinal worms, lice, and other organisms that these women carried. The concentrations are so high that they indicate chronic, overwhelming infestations that would have made normal life impossible. The diseases and parasites that flourished in Roman brothels didn't remain contained within those walls. They spread throughout the city through the clients who visited multiple establishments and the women who occasionally moved between different working locations. The prostitution industry became a disease reservoir that affected public health across the entire urban area. Client mobility patterns, reconstructed from ancient records and archaeological evidence, show that men frequently visited multiple brothels in a single evening, carrying infections from one establishment to another. This created a web of disease transmission that connected all the prostitution sites in the city and ensured that any outbreak would spread rapidly through the entire network. The families of clients were also affected, as men carried home diseases contracted in the brothels, while the wives and children of citizens had access to better medical care than the prostitutes themselves. They still suffered from infections that could have been prevented if the conditions in the brothels had been better regulated. Water supplies became contaminated when waste from brothel areas seeped into wells and aqueduct systems. The primitive sewage systems of ancient Rome were not designed to handle the concentrated waste production of districts like the Sabura, and overflow frequently contaminated drinking water sources. Food vendors who served the prostitution districts often became disease vectors themselves, carrying contaminated products to other parts of the city. The lack of food safety regulations meant that spoiled or contaminated provisions could spread illness far beyond their original sources. The clothing and bedding industries that served the brothels also became pathways for disease transmission. Fabrics that had been used in infected environments were often resold to other customers without proper cleaning, spreading parasites and pathogens throughout the textile trade. The financial structures that supported Roman prostitution created elaborate networks of profit that extended far beyond the immediate operators of brothels. Every level of society found ways to extract wealth from the systematic exploitation of these vulnerable women, creating economic incentives to maintain rather than reform the system. Tax collectors were among the most direct beneficiaries, as prostitution generated significant revenue for local governments. The registration fees, occupational taxes, and various levies imposed on sex workers provided steady income streams that officials became dependent upon. Reform movements that might have improved conditions for the women were often opposed because they threatened these revenue sources. Landlords who owned properties in prostitution districts charged premium rents for spaces that they would never maintain to decent standards. They understood that brothel operators had limited options for locations and would pay high prices for even the most degraded facilities. This created a real estate market based on deliberate neglect and exploitation. Moneylenders who provided credit to brothel owners often used the women themselves as collateral, creating debt arrangements that could literally own human beings. These financial instruments made women into tradable commodities whose value fluctuated based on their age, health, and appearance. Suppliers of goods and services to the prostitution industry formed cartels that fixed prices and controlled access to necessities. Women who needed soap, clothing, or food had no choice but to pay whatever prices were demanded, as alternative suppliers were systematically excluded from these markets. Construction workers who built and maintained brothels were complicit in creating facilities designed to maximize profits while minimizing human comfort. The architectural choices made in these buildings, low ceilings, poor ventilation, minimal lighting, were deliberate decisions to reduce construction costs while controlling the women who would be housed there. Insurance and protection services evolved around the prostitution trade, with various criminal organizations offering security in exchange for regular payments. These arrangements created additional financial burdens for brothel operators, costs that were inevitably passed on to the women through reduced earnings or increased fees. Roman law created and maintained legal structures that institutionalized the degradation of prostitutes while protecting the interests of those who profited from their exploitation. These laws were carefully crafted to appear morally neutral, while actually ensuring that women in prostitution would remain trapped in cycles of poverty and abuse. Registration requirements served multiple purposes beyond simple taxation. They created permanent records that followed women throughout their lives, making it virtually impossible to escape the stigma of prostitution, even if they managed to leave the trade. These records also provided authorities with lists of women who could be subjected to special regulations and restrictions. Zoning laws that confined prostitution to specific districts had the effect of creating ghettos where normal civil protections didn't apply. Within these zones, different rules governed everything from property maintenance to personal safety, effectively creating areas where human rights were suspended. Testimony restrictions that made prostitutes' words inadmissible in legal proceedings left them without recourse when they were victims of crimes. This legal vulnerability was well known to potential perpetrators, making prostitutes attractive targets for violence and theft. Property rights laws allowed brothel owners to claim ownership of their workers' possessions, including any money the women might have saved. This made it impossible for prostitutes to accumulate the resources needed to escape their situations, as any wealth they created could be legally confiscated. Contract law permitted agreements that would be considered slavery by modern standards, allowing people to sign over their freedom in exchange for food, shelter, or payment of debts. These contracts were often impossible to fulfill, creating permanent bondage disguised as legitimate business arrangements. Immigration and citizenship laws made it particularly difficult for foreign women to escape prostitution, as they had no legal standing to seek protection or redress. Women who had been captured in warfare or sold by their families had no legal identity beyond their status as property. Religious institutions developed complex theological frameworks that justified the systematic degradation of prostitutes while absolving society of any responsibility for improving their conditions. These religious teachings became so deeply embedded in Roman culture that they made reform efforts seem not just unnecessary, but actually immoral. Priests taught that prostitutes served important social functions by providing outlets for male desires that might otherwise lead to adultery or rape. This utilitarian view of women's bodies as pressure valves for male sexuality made their suffering seem like a necessary sacrifice for social stability. Purification rituals that excluded prostitutes from religious ceremonies reinforced their status as permanently contaminated beings whose presence would pollute sacred spaces. These exclusions were presented as natural consequences of moral choices rather than as arbitrary social constructions. Concepts of sin and redemption were applied selectively, with prostitutes being portrayed as willing participants in corruption rather than as victims of circumstances. The possibility of forgiveness and spiritual renewal was theoretically available, but practically impossible to achieve within the social structures that defined their lives. religious festivals and public celebrations that brought communities together explicitly excluded prostitutes, reinforcing their social isolation and marking them as outsiders who had no place in civilized society. These exclusions were justified as protecting the moral atmosphere of religious observances. Charitable activities organized by religious institutions focused on helping the deserving poor, while explicitly excluding prostitutes from consideration. This selective compassion reinforced the idea that some forms of suffering were acceptable while others deserved intervention. Marriage and family laws that prohibited prostitutes from entering into legal unions ensured that they would remain isolated from the social structures that provided stability and support to other women. These legal barriers were presented as protecting the institution of marriage rather than as punishment for the women themselves. Without the basic tools and systems that we take for granted, even the most determined efforts to stay clean were doomed to failure. Water distribution systems that served wealthy neighborhoods were not extended to the districts where prostitutes lived and worked. The engineering expertise that created magnificent aqueducts and public fountains was not applied to ensuring that all residents had access to clean water. Soap manufacturing technology produced harsh, caustic products that often caused more skin damage than cleaning benefit. The chemical knowledge needed to create gentle, effective cleansing agents was not available to the people who needed it most. Textile production methods created fabrics that were either too expensive for prostitutes to afford or too crude to maintain proper hygiene. The techniques for producing soft, absorbent, easily cleaned cloth were reserved for luxury markets that served wealthy customers. Sewage and waste management systems were primitive and often created more health hazards than they solved. The engineering solutions that worked for small populations became inadequate when applied to dense urban areas with concentrated waste production. Medical instruments and procedures were so crude that treatment often caused more harm than disease. The surgical tools available were not designed for precision or patient comfort, and the lack of anesthesia made many beneficial procedures too traumatic to attempt. Food preservation and storage technologies were inadequate to prevent spoilage and contamination, especially in hot climates and crowded conditions. The lack of refrigeration and effective preservatives meant that nutrition was always compromised for people who couldn't afford the freshest provisions. Lighting technology that depended on oil lamps and candles created fire hazards and air pollution, while providing inadequate illumination for detailed personal care tasks. The inability to see clearly made it impossible to maintain the kind of hygiene standards that would have improved health outcomes. The systematic psychological destruction of prostitutes was as deliberate and effective as their physical degradation, creating mental and emotional damage that made resistance or escape psychologically impossible, even when external opportunities arose. Identity erasure began from the moment women entered prostitution, with their original names being replaced by nicknames that reduced them to sexual objects or geographic origins. This destruction of personal identity was a crucial step in the dehumanization process that made their treatment seem acceptable. Constant humiliation was built into every aspect of their daily routines, from the degrading medical examinations they were subjected to the public registration processes that marked them as prostitutes for life. These humiliations were designed to break down self-respect and create learned helplessness. Isolation from normal human relationships was enforced through social stigma and legal restrictions that prevented prostitutes from forming friendships, romantic attachments, or family connections outside their working environment. This isolation made them completely dependent on their exploiters for any form of human contact. False hope was occasionally offered through stories of women who had escaped prostitution or improved their circumstances, but these narratives were carefully controlled to prevent any realistic assessment of escape possibilities. The rare success stories served to blame other women for their failure to achieve similar outcomes. Competitive dynamics were deliberately fostered among the women to prevent solidarity and mutual support that might have led to organized resistance. Brothel operators used various techniques to ensure that the women saw each other as threats rather than potential allies. Trauma bonding with their abusers was encouraged through cycles of punishment and reward that created psychological dependency on the very people who were destroying their lives. This emotional manipulation made it difficult for women to accurately assess their situations or seek help from outside sources. The damage inflicted on Roman prostitutes extended far beyond their own lifespans, creating cycles of trauma and dysfunction that affected multiple generations of their descendants. The children born into these environments inherited not just poverty and disease, but entire worldviews shaped by systematic dehumanization. Prenatal exposure to malnutrition, disease, and toxic substances created developmental problems that followed children throughout their lives. limiting their cognitive abilities and physical health in ways that made escape from poverty nearly impossible. The mother's compromised health during pregnancy had lasting effects on their offspring. Early childhood trauma from witnessing violence, exploitation, and degradation created psychological damage that affected these children's ability to form healthy relationships or function in normal social environments. The normalization of extreme behavior patterns made it difficult for them to recognize abuse or seek help. Educational deprivation ensured that children born in prostitution districts would lack the skills and knowledge needed to improve their circumstances, creating another generation trapped in cycles of poverty and exploitation. The stigma attached to their origins made it unlikely that they would receive opportunities for advancement. Social rejection based on their family backgrounds meant that these children faced discrimination and exclusion that limited their options for employment, marriage, and social mobility. The sins of their mothers were visited upon their children in ways that made intergenerational poverty almost inevitable. Health problems inherited from their parents included not just genetic predispositions to certain diseases, but also exposure to parasites, infections, and toxic substances that compromised their immune systems and overall vitality from birth. Cultural transmission of survival strategies that had been necessary in the brothel environment often proved maladaptive in other contexts, making it difficult for children to adjust to different social environments, even when opportunities arose. The physical layout and infrastructure of Roman prostitution districts created environmental conditions that made human dignity impossible to maintain, demonstrating how urban planning decisions can systematically destroy the lives of vulnerable populations. Street design in areas like the Sabura prioritized commercial traffic over human habitability, creating narrow alleys that trapped smoke, odors, and disease while providing minimal access to fresh air and sunlight. The claustrophobic environment contributed to both physical and mental health problems. Building codes that applied to other parts of the city were relaxed or ignored in prostitution districts, allowing construction of facilities that would have been condemned elsewhere. The substandard construction created safety hazards while ensuring that living conditions remained degraded. Waste management systems were either absent or inadequate in these districts, creating public health hazards that affected everyone who lived or worked in the area. The accumulation of human and animal waste created breeding grounds for disease and vermin that made normal life impossible. Water supply infrastructure was not extended to prostitution districts, forcing residents to rely on contaminated sources or expensive water vendors who took advantage of their desperation. The lack of clean water made basic hygiene impossible to maintain. Market placement concentrated vendors of substandard goods in these areas while keeping quality merchants away, creating food deserts where residents had access only to spoiled or adulterated provisions. The poor nutrition available contributed to the health problems that plagued these communities. Transportation networks were designed to facilitate the movement of clients into and out of prostitution districts, while making it difficult for residents to travel to other parts of the city. This geographical isolation reinforced social exclusion and made escape more difficult. Roman physicians and medical institutions were not passive observers of the health crisis in prostitution districts. They were active participants in maintaining systems that ensured these women would remain sick, degraded, and dependent on their exploiters. Medical training that used prostitutes as teaching subjects dehumanized them in the minds of future physicians, ensuring that the next generation of doctors would view these women as objects of study rather than patients deserving of care. This educational approach institutionalized medical indifference to their suffering. Research practices that tested dangerous procedures and medicines on prostitutes without their consent advanced medical knowledge, while sacrificing the lives and health of vulnerable women who had no legal recourse for harm done to them. Diagnostic categories that classified certain diseases as prostitute diseases created medical justifications for discrimination and exclusion, making it seem scientifically rational to deny treatment to women whose conditions were supposedly caused by their moral failings. Treatment protocols that were developed specifically for prostitutes were often designed to manage rather than cure their conditions, ensuring that they would remain functional enough to work while never fully recovering their health. Professional associations that excluded physicians who treated prostitutes created economic incentives for doctors to avoid this patient population, ensuring that medical care would remain unavailable to the women who needed it most. Medical literature that documented the health problems of prostitutes focused on protecting other populations from contamination, rather than on developing effective treatments for the women themselves. reinforcing their status as sources of danger rather than victims deserving of care. The financial calculations that governed the prostitution industry were designed with mathematical precision to ensure maximum profit extraction, while maintaining women in states of desperate dependence that made escape impossible. Pricing structures for services were set just high enough to ensure that women could earn survival-level income while never accumulating enough resources to improve their situations or leave the trade. The rates were calculated to maintain a delicate balance between hope and despair. Cost structures for basic necessities in prostitution districts were inflated to absorb any excess income that women might have earned, ensuring that increased earnings would not translate into improved living conditions or accumulation of escape resources. Debt arrangements were structured so that they could never be fully repaid, creating permanent financial obligations that bound women to their creditors regardless of how much money they earned over time. The mathematics of these arrangements made freedom economically impossible. Investment patterns in the prostitution industry prioritize short-term profit extraction over long-term sustainability, as investors understood that individual women were replaceable resources rather than valuable assets worthy of maintenance and development. Insurance calculations that assessed the value of women's lives and health were based purely on their earning potential rather than any consideration of human worth, creating actuarial frameworks that treated human beings as depreciating commodities. Tax structures that applied to prostitution were designed to maximize government revenue while providing no services or protections in return, making the women net contributors to public coffers that provided them with no benefits. And so the machine ground on, generation after generation, processing human lives through its gears with mechanical efficiency. The women who entered this system carrying hopes and dreams were systematically broken down into component parts, their bodies commodified, their minds destroyed, their spirits crushed, until nothing remained but the economic value they could generate for others. The stench that filled those ancient corridors was not just the smell of unwashed bodies and poor sanitation, it was the odor of human souls being systematically destroyed, of dignity being ground into dust beneath the wheels of a machine designed to extract profit from suffering. It was the smell of a civilization that built monuments to its own greatness, while its foundations rested on the broken bodies of the most vulnerable members of society. Tonight, as you settle into your clean bed with fresh water flowing from taps and soap readily available at the touch of a hand, remember that these simple luxuries represent freedoms that thousands of women throughout history died without ever experiencing. The distance between our world and theirs is measured not just in centuries, but in fundamental transformations of how civilized societies understand their obligations to protect and care for all their members, especially the most vulnerable among us.